Greetings, Captain Crabs, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's adjust our focus today and take a look at one particular 40k faction, the Lamenters. You've probably noticed Wib's Lamenters army showing up in various videos over the last year, and if you have, I'm sorry, I've tried to stop him but he just keeps putting them in there.
In my defence, the Lamenters are an interesting Space Marine chapter, from their chronic unluckiness to the fact that they're a Blood Angel's successor that seemed to be able to avoid the Black Rage, for a while anyway, to their paint scheme that seems to exist mostly as a flex for people like me masochistic enough to collect them. They also, notably, have been around since near the beginning of 40k, and have had just enough written about them that one could put together a reasonably complete history of them, and put it all in one reasonably sized YouTube video.
Which is what this is, by the way. Enjoy! The very first appearance we could find of a Lamenter was within 40k's first year, in White Dwarf issue 99 from March of 1988. There we see their distinctive yellow and checkerboard colour scheme used on Captain Crab in an ad for new Space Marine models. Because, yeah, the models were given specific names even if they weren't named characters back then. It was fun. Plus, if you were lucky, it meant that they did a model with your surname. Anyway, on Captain Crab you can sort of make out the start of something that would plague Lamenters players ever since. Trying to figure out just how exactly you line up the checks around a curved shoulder pad.
I do have a little bit of an answer for that, by the way, if you're interested. Basically, you just draw them on in pencil first. Mechanical pencil for preference, but a regular pencil will work just fine too. It can take a little while to figure out the nuances, like, how you curve it around the pad and stuff, but you'll figure it out. You're smart, I believe in you. Technically speaking, there was also a couple of images in the 1987 rulebook that show a medic with a heart icon on his helmet, but without any yellow or visible checkerboard. We're happy to say he's not a Lamenter. The heart is likely just because, he's a medic. However, Captain Crab was just a little taster for the Lamenter's first real spotlight. A few months later, in White Dwarf issue 101, and reprinted in the Warhammer 40,000 Compendium, they would feature as one of the participants in the Bada War, where a handful of Marine chapters turned against the Imperium, a sort of mini-heresy, if you will. Not much is said about the Lamenters in specific, beyond that they sided with the the Tiger Claws in their rebellion, and that they were stomped into surrender by the Minotaurs. Afterwards they were granted the Emperor's forgiveness, provided they undertook a 100-year penitent crusade.
Here we get a better look at that colour scheme, which has, to be honest, barely changed over the last 35 years. The only big difference, barring the helmet stripe, is that the heart went from a red to black gradient to just solid red. Although sadly they didn't get a bizarre camo pattern variant like many other chapters did, which is a pity. Wib had to make his own. Also, as a side note, their bleeding heart icon wasn't unique to them. It was seen just a few months previous in the Book of the Astronomicon. Although there it was used on a group within the White Scars who called themselves the Soul Drinkers. Not to be confused with, the Soul Drinkers. Rogue Trader was just kinda like that sometimes. Of course, the bleeding heart as a symbol to represent lamentation or an outpouring of emotion wasn't some unique GW creation. It's an old literary and often religious thing. The term bleeding heart has also got a fair amount of political baggage, unfortunately. Thanks, Pegler. You dick. Although, I suppose it is neat that their later fluff would kinda tie into how the insult was used, since they do seem to show an unusual amount of care for the regular citizens of the Imperium, especially considering they're a Space Marine chapter. So the Lamenter's first proper appearance was minor, but to be fair, that's true of all the chapters introduced here, since an entire war is condensed into half a page. Nobody really had time to shine too brightly.
Heading into the 90s, the Lamenters settled into their role as just being, around. Mentioned here and there for their participation in the Bada War, but mostly in a new role, as chew toys for the Tyranids. Like in 1990, where they were mentioned in a story by Lindsay Deladue-Patin in White Dwarf 131, where Inquisitor Cryptman was looking into their disappearance only to find a marine-shaped hole full of Tyranids, implying that the Lamenters had been entirely wiped out, something reinforced by a 1992 White Dwarf article about the Tyranids that let us know that it was Hive Fleet Kraken that did the deed. The 1993 novel Space Marine by noted incredibly not weird guy Ian Watson would also allude to this Tyranid-based fate for the Lamenters. Interestingly, a Zote, acting as an ambassador for the Tyranids, would say that the Lamenters were who they learned the language of men from. Also, since I don't know when we'll ever get to mention that book again, Ian Watson's Space Marine contains an Imperial fist called Biff, which I think is quite funny.
Despite the very real possibility of them being entirely dead, the Lamenters did show up in a 1999 chapter approved list of Space Marine chapters, where they were not listed as being destroyed, so we got a little bit of hope.
Hey, it's editing, Wib. I hate to interrupt, but I just noticed that in that list there's the Marines Errant and the Marines Erranter, which has real the cooler Daniel energy. Okay, you can get back to the video now, sorry.
Likewise, they also appeared in a list of every single Space Marine chapter in the second edition of the Space Marine Collector's Guide from 2003, with the first official image of one in quite some time. Well, one that we could locate anyway. Although it was unfortunately just a dodgy Photoshop. Granted, that was true of many of the chapters in there too, but the Lamenters one was particularly dodgy.
Also, if you're here for needless pedantry, and I know I am, the Mantis Warriors, who were featured in the 1988 Bada War article along with the Lamenters, weren't in either the Collector's Guide or in the chapter approved list, which I'd say was a strange oversight, but be honest, how often do you actually think about the Mantis Warriors? Oh, what's that? The furious typing of the 10 people who play Mantis Warriors? I'm just kidding. Plus the Fire Angels were missing from both those lists as well. It's just that, you know, some people do actually play Mantis Warriors. In White Dwarf 260 from 2001, there was an article on the Cursed Founding. This talked about a founding of Space Marine chapters where various chapters' gene seed was altered to try and improve them. It did not work particularly well. Mutations were abound, and the chapters formed during it are known not only for the mutations, but for generally being unlucky. Cursed, one could say. In time, we got playable rules for some of these cursed chapters, as seen in Chapter Approved 2004, and the Lamenters were among them. It suggested that they may be the result of an experiment to remove the deficiencies in the Blood Angel's gene seed, so no Red Thirst or Black Rage, allowing the Lamenters to fight as a regular Codex-compliant chapter, devoid of a death company. Side note, a lot of the sources that we use in this video tend to use Black Rage and Red Thirst fairly interchangeably, so, you know, just think of them as being the same thing for now. I know they're different, but just don't worry about it. Anyway, the Lamenters' apparent success over their gene seed's flaws came with a catch. They were brutally unlucky, and tragedy followed them wherever they went.
The first example of this it brings up is their siding with the now renamed Astral Claws in the Bada War, which wasn't out of any sense of rebellion, but rather that they had fought alongside the Astral Claws before, and saw the Imperial attack on them as a challenge to the sovereignty and independence of the whole Adeptus Astartes. This turned out to be a bad call. And the second example was that it was the Penitent Crusade afterwards that led them into High Fleet Kraken, who ate most of what was left of them, leaving only around 300 Lamenters remaining. This neatly tied the two big things we knew about them previously together, as well as confirming that they did, in fact, survive. In-game, what made them separate from their other cursed brethren is the Aura of Doom rule, where enemies wishing to assault a Lamenter squad must pass a leadership test in order to do so. This is because, quote, the aura of tragedy surrounding the Lamenters is a palpable thing, projected in waves before them and forcing their enemies back. So yeah, these guys managed to weaponize bad vibes.
Despite a connection to the Blood Angels suggested, they would not be featured in the next Blood Angels Codex in 2007, but since that codex was actually just a couple of articles in White Dwarf, I'm sure they didn't take it too personally. Although in 2008 they did get a very brief mention in the novel Red Fury, confirming their Blood Angels successor status and first demonstrating one of their lesser talked about traits, not showing up when the Blood Angels call for them. 2009 would see the Lamenters gain a named character in the foul-tempered Deathwatch Dreadnought, Chiron, who would show up in some Black Library stories by Steve Parker over the next few years. Chiron was seconded to the Deathwatch prior to the Lamenters encountering High Fleet Kraken, and so believed himself to be the last surviving Lamenter, which would put anyone in a bit of a mood, I suppose. 2010 would be a big year for the Lamenters, not just because they finally got mentioned in a Blood Angels Codex, but because Forge World decided to take a look at the Bada War, and in doing so gave the Lamenters, well, pretty much everything else we know about them.
Imperial Armor Volume 9, The Bada War Part 1 was the first half of Forge World's dive into the Bada War conflict, reimagining many of the chapters involved into their modern interpretations. So you can thank/blame them for the fact that we generally don't call them space sharks anymore. Although, unlike the other things we've seen so far, these books did remember that the Mantis Warriors were a thing, so that's nice. Still, this meant the Lamenters got a huge update and elaboration.
For starters, we learned that they used their fleet-based nature to bugger off to the edges of the Imperium, whilst some of their more wayward, cursed founding brethren were busy getting purged, spending the next millennia and a half fighting alien threats at the edge of humanity's domain, often helping small isolated colonies. However, these conflicts were mired with rumours of the chapter suffering from incredibly bad luck, and so when they were finally recalled, many other Marine chapters viewed them with suspicion. In fact, the superstitious Mortifactors chapter refused to fight alongside them during the 9th Black Crusade, leaving the Lamenters alone to defend the population of a hive city. Unwilling to leave the populace to the Black Legion, they fought for 6 weeks until the Ultramarines and White Scars arrived to relieve them. The Lamenters suffered horrendous losses, being reduced to around 200 Marines, and promptly got lost in a warp storm straight afterwards, reappearing a century later having battled their way back from the outer void. As you can see, they really cannot catch a break.
Once they had replenished their numbers, they were requested to form a part of the defences in the Maelstrom Zone, where they would become close allies with the Astral Claws, who actually treated the Lamenters, well, nicely? Not, abandoning them in the middle of a bloodbath, unlike some chapters we could mention. This is now a Mortifactors hate channel. As the Bada War broke out, the Lamenters sided with the Astral Claws, since, again, they're basically the only people who were ever nice to them. However, unbeknownst to the Lamenters, the Astral Claws leader, Luft Huron, was a bit of a rotter and used the Lamenters for his own ends. After many years of war, the Minotaurs remembered that old bit of fluff about them decimating the Lamenters, and attacked the Mater Lacrimarum, the Lamenters' flagship that contained not only their gene seed stores, but their war casualties too. This caused the Lamenters to pull back their fleet to defend it, and were eventually beaten into surrender by the much more numerous Minotaurs. The surviving 311 Lamenters spent the rest of the war in a prison hulk.
Also, if you were wondering what their flagship's name means, Mater Lacrimarum translates to Mother of Tears or Our Lady of Tears, a name that's either a reference to the writings of Thomas de Quincey or to a 2007 Dario Argento horror film. And given that this is Games Workshop, it could go either way. But since the latter takes inspiration from the former, I suppose it doesn't really matter. It also explains why a latter Imperial armor would name-drop a Lamenters ship called the Mater Suspiria too. The other notable story we're told is of the liberation of Slaughterhouse 3, which sounds like a 1970s exploitation film, but since I just mentioned Argento and it's 40k, what do you want from him? During the Corinth Crusade, the Lamenters petitioned to assault the Orc slave mining world Slaughterhouse 3, not just for the military importance of the planet, but also because of the plight of its citizens. Ugh, typical bleeding heart liberals. Believing it to be a one-way trip, Marneus Calgar agreed to let the Lamenters try, but let them know they'd be doing so alone. And so the Lamenters assaulted the planet, catching the Orcs off guard, and, joined by the imprisoned human population, liberated the planet. However, slight miscalculation, they now had 3 million ex-prisoners and no way of moving that many people off-world. The Lamenters were unwilling to simply leave them, and so defended them from an Orc counterattack, whilst they tried to make whatever captured warp-capable ships they had spaceworthy. Ultimately, most of the prisoners chose to stay in the mines as they were destroyed, and only a tenth of them made it off-world, and at least half the Lamenters were killed. With the mines destroyed, the mission had technically been a success, but the Lamenters felt it was a bitter one, refusing the honour of an Iron Halo from Calgar, which made them even less popular as many others saw this as an insult.
Regarding the chapter and its lack of Death Company, The book said that the attempts to cure this Blood Angel successor of the flaws in their gene seed were not 100% successful, although did reduce the amount of Marines falling to the Red Thirst greatly. However, the chapter was gripped by a dark melancholy, and their fellow Blood Angel successors suggest this was because they bore the grief of the death of Sanguinius more keenly than others. In more recent times, the Red Thirst has reawoken in the chapter, and their temperament has only gotten more grim. We're also shown that they do now possess a death company, so their days of being the Blood Angel's successor who beat their flaws were officially over. Imperial Armour also gave us a little info on their fighting style. They favour shock assault tactics with close air support. They do possess the unique equipment associated with the Blood Angels, like Baal Predators, but have them in short supply, presumably since they're harder to get when out on the edges of the Imperium. They also have very few suits of Terminator armour. An interesting note is that their sanguinary priests are known as the Calyx, who not only help out with their medical needs, but also the, quote, spiritual stigmata that they bear. I think that makes them battle therapists. Rad.
Another neat thing is that we got a playable Lamenters special character in this book. Malachim Foros, Master of the Lamenters, Lord of Ruin, Watcher of the Deeps. This golden-armoured lad held a distrust for the Adeptus Terra, and some say that he has nearly fallen to the Black Rage multiple times. He's also dead. Probably. He was unaccounted for after the battle with the Minotaurs, but some have claimed that he survived amongst the floating wreckage. The most interesting thing he could do in-game was that his Rage unto Death rule meant that once he was wounded, he gained the Rage special rule and got +1 to his strength and attacks, since the sight of his own blood made him lose control. Malachim sadly never got a model from Forge World, but then a lot of characters given rules in these books didn't either, so it's nothing personal. Another little tidbit from this book that has nothing to do with Malachim or the Lamenters, but is related to something we mentioned earlier. The Tiger Claws were rewritten as not just the old retconned name for the Astral Claws, they were stated to be an Astral Claw successor who were later absorbed back into their ranks. The second Bada War book from 2011 would confirm that once the war was over, the surviving Lamenters would still be sent on their 100-year penitent crusade to atone for their transgressions, and had to do so without recruiting any more Marines, their survival left in their own hands and the grace of the Emperor. They also had to surrender ships and war gear to the Minotaurs, which must have stung since they were the ones they fought so bitterly to defend them against.
Also in 2011, the Lamenters would get a mention in the Deathwatch Rites of Battle book, giving you rules to play a Lamenter character and reiterating that they can fall to the Red Thirst. Also, a handful of them were on a ship that had a drive failure, killing most of them, and honestly, what's a few more dead Lamenters at this point? Although it does end up meaning that there's a Deathwatch squad that's just Lamenters. In recent editions, the Lamenters have been name-dropped only a few times, such as once again not showing up when the Blood Angels called for them with their fellow successor chapters to defend Baal from Hive Fleet Leviathan, as they didn't feel like it and lacked the numbers to do so. We also learned that they succeeded against Hive Fleet Kraken, which is nice to know, and since we've seen Primaris Lamenters kicking about, it seems that since they last spoke to their parents, they're no longer barred from recruiting and aren't on the brink of being wiped out anymore, which is also nice. Although they say in recent Blood Angels codices that the Lamenters have been brought to the brink of destruction twice, and looking at everything we've talked about today, that feels like they are thoroughly lowballing it. Also, during the Psychic Awakening, there was a brief mention of them showing up to a prison station and taking a bunch of prisoners. Not really sure what that was all about, but it's good to have hobbies, I guess.
So it took a while for their theme to fully coalesce, but once it did, the Lamenters ended up oddly relatable for giant post-humans wearing bright yellow tank armour. A group of lads with depression who, despite being part of a horrifying authoritarian system where most of their allies don't really like them, seem to actually try and do the right and honourable thing wherever possible. By Space Marine standards anyway, the bar is very low. But they are unfortunately also prone to making kind of bad decisions that are often followed by horrible luck. They just like me, for real. But as their current chapter master says, with every travail they have overcome, the Lamenters have only grown stronger. Some people have pointed out over the years that it is a little weird how many times they've been reduced to 200 to 300 Marines, since if you try and combine all this stuff into one timeline, the numbers and time frames don't really seem to match up all that well. But I'd say that's more of a demonstration of the dangers of getting specific with numbers when you're writing for a franchise made nearly entirely out of soft retcons. As ever, we are sure that there is some stuff that we missed out in there. We did have to sift through 35 years of stuff, and things can easily slip through the cracks, but hopefully this shows how a faction can pretty much never be the main characters, but still amass a fairly interesting backstory. As it stands, the Lamenters are a neat little faction, with enough background fluff written about them to give them a real identity, but with just enough vagueness there that you can really put your own spin on them should you choose to collect them.
Plus, I do feel we're all collectively ignoring just how cute their little heart symbol is.
Hello there, thank you very much for watching. Like the Lamenters themselves, this video was seemingly cursed and so took way longer to put together than it reasonably should have, so thank you very much for your patience as we finished it off. Additional thanks to my Twitter followers who helped me track down some of the more obscure Lamenters mentions during the 90s, and a big thank you to Alignment Inc., who very kindly let us use their Lamenters artwork. As you might have noticed, the official artwork of them is pretty sparse, so it was very appreciated. Please go check them out on Twitter. Commission them. Do it. Do it. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, then please consider giving it a like, maybe leave a comment letting us know what your favourite minor Space Marine chapter is, and if you'd like to support the channel in a way that puts food in our mouths, then please check out patreon.com/snipeandwib, where you can join the names of the illustrious fellows scrolling past right now. Also, yeah, I know it's the last day of June as I record this, but happy Pride everyone, and we'll see you next time.